In a desperate bid for revenge against Mark Grayson, Angstrom Levy assembled alternate versions of Invincible from various dimensions. After they had laid waste to various cities on the planet for 3 days, Angstrom met with them on top of Mark's house, where there were only 9 left. These versions, each corrupted by darker paths, were eventually imprisoned by Angstrom in a barren, desolate dimension after they grew impatient and turned on him. His plan was to retrieve them later for a final confrontation with Mark, but fate had other plans. Before Angstrom could act, he was captured by the technicians, who intended to exploit his knowledge and abilities for their own benefit. This left the 8 alternate Marks stranded with no way out. At first, the 8 Marks spent their time talking, sharing stories of the events that led them to evil. Each one had a unique reason for their descent. Some were broken by trauma, others corrupted by power, and a few were simply victims of cruel fate. As the weeks passed and hunger set in, tensions rose, and it became evident that one of them, an arrogant and insufferable version, was despised by the others. Eventually, driven by starvation and resentment, the group decided to kill and eat him in order to survive. As the days wore on and the group shrank, the most ruthless of the Marks, Sinister Mark, began subtly manipulating the others, encouraging further cannibalism. One by one, they turned on each other. Mohawk Mark, one of the more conflicted versions, initially participated in the gruesome act, but soon realized how monstrous it was. Disgusted by his own actions, he stopped eating his counterparts, instead drinking his own sweat and finding other desperate means to survive. Meanwhile, Sinister Mark, whose hunger had pushed him to madness, embraced cannibalism. The experience triggered primal memories from his own dimension, where he had resorted to consuming human flesh in times of crisis. His appearance mirrored his descent, his hair growing long and wild as he transformed into a true monster. As time wore on, only 3 of them remained, the hunger unbearable. Sinister Mark and another evil version of Mark turned on the weakest of the trio, mercilessly killing and devouring him. Horrified by their actions, Mohawk Mark fled before he could become their next victim. Sinister Mark, now completely consumed by madness, relentlessly pursued him, but Mohawk Mark managed to evade him. Time passed, and the situation grew worse. Now only Sinister Mark and one other evil Mark were left, with the weaker version finding himself at the mercy of Sinister Mark, who had become something inhuman. Without hesitation, Sinister Mark overpowered and killed his final counterpart. When the mainstream Mark arrived in the alternate dimension, confused, he stumbled upon Sinister Mark, devouring the remains of the alternate Mark. Sinister Mark invited the mainstream Mark to join him, remarking that there was plenty of flesh left. He explained that he had begun eating his counterpart because he had recently killed him, and that the fire was the best part. Sinister Mark also believed that the mainstream Mark was one of the original 7 stranded with him, forgetting about Mohawk Mark's survival. While the mainstream Mark watched, Sinister Mark explained how the alternate Marks had mistakenly believed he had planned the cannibalism. He reminisced about how desperate and starving they had become after weeks of isolation, with the first one they ate being the hardest to bear. Sinister Mark then questioned whether the mainstream Mark was real or if they had already eaten him. Upon touching the mainstream Mark, Sinister Mark realized he was real, though recently stranded. Mohawk Mark, watching silently, decided not to intervene as the situation escalated. The mainstream Mark, realizing who Sinister Mark truly was, punched him away, sending him tumbling. Sinister Mark, unfazed, remarked that his hunger never waned, but that he was growing bored. He thanked the mainstream Mark for the fight before declaring that the winner would feast on the loser's remains. The mainstream Mark, attempting to reason with Sinister Mark, offered to help him return home, but Sinister Mark rejected this, pointing out that the alternate Marks had not weakened from hunger like the mainstream Mark, who had endured much less suffering and was therefore unfit to survive in this world. As the mainstream Mark tried to negotiate, Sinister Mark coldly stated that the only way to help him was to be devoured. Realizing there was no way out through reasoning, the mainstream Mark took off, attempting to outrun Sinister Mark. The two clashed again, with Sinister Mark closing the distance and finally catching up. He threw the mainstream Mark to the ground with bone-shattering force, and as the dust settled, he prepared to finish the fight. But before he could, Mohawk Mark arrived, colliding with Sinister Mark and knocking him away. Without wasting a second, Mohawk Mark grabbed the mainstream Mark and they both ascended into the sky, putting distance between themselves and the relentless pursuer. Sinister Mark, undeterred, tracked them down once more. He charged toward the mainstream Mark, focusing entirely on his prey, ignoring Mohawk Mark. The mainstream Mark, seeing the opportunity, struck Sinister Mark, sending him flying. Mohawk Mark then slammed Sinister Mark into the ground and unleashed a vicious assault, his punches filled with anger and betrayal. As he battered Sinister Mark, Mohawk Mark shouted about how they could have escaped together, how there had been another way. He blamed Sinister Mark for turning them against each other, for dooming them all. The fight ended with Mohawk Mark delivering the final blow, killing Sinister Mark before the mainstream Mark could intervene. Afterward, Angstrom Levy opened a portal back to the mainstream dimension. The mainstream Mark, eager to return home, rushed through the portal, only to be trapped by Angstrom. Moments later, Mohawk Mark crossed into the mainstream dimension and immediately attacked Angstrom. Their fight raged on until the mainstream Mark reminded Mohawk Mark that if Angstrom died, he would have no way of returning home. Hesitant, Mohawk Mark allowed Angstrom to trap him. Though Angstrom had a change of heart, he expressed regret for his actions and apologized to the mainstream Mark, releasing them both. Angstrom opened a portal to Mohawk Mark's home dimension, but before it could close, Mohawk Mark grabbed Angstrom, dragging him back through. In his dimension, Mohawk Mark subjected Angstrom to brutal torture, demanding he help him conquer other dimensions. Angstrom, however, refused, determined not to give in to Mohawk Mark's demands. As time passed, Mohawk Mark changed, shaving his goatee and filling the void left by Adam Eve's death by hiring women to cosplay as her. Eventually, the mainstream Mark and the mainstream robot arrived in Mohawk Mark's dimension to retrieve Angstrom. They were escorted by Conquest to Mohawk Mark's personal chambers, where the mainstream Mark noticed the Adam Eve imposters. Mohawk Mark admitted that in his dimension, Adam Eve had died and this was how he coped. Despite their differences, Mohawk Mark thanked the mainstream Mark for helping him escape the alternate dimension and let go of any lingering resentment. When the mainstream Mark asked about Angstrom, Mohawk Mark assured him that the matter was settled. He led them to the facility where his scientists were holding Angstrom, explaining that they were removing his powers. The mainstream Mark, horrified by the extent of Mohawk Mark's cruelty, was disturbed. However, Mohawk Mark dismissed the mainstream Mark's concerns, implying that if the mainstream Mark ever turned evil, he could rule his world. Just then, the mainstream robot realized that the mainstream Mark might become an obstacle to his own plans. He used a lethal sonic pulse to incapacitate both the mainstream Mark and Mohawk Mark, then executed Mohawk Mark's scientists to eliminate any witnesses. As Mohawk Mark struggled to recover, the robot fired a bomb into his mouth. The explosion ruptured his throat and organs, killing him instantly. The last of Angstrom's recruited Marks met his end in a tragic, violent conclusion.